Alright everybody, so I thought we would just go through a few very brief, very simple little exercises or stretches that we can do just at that point when we're about to transition from being on the ground to getting on our horse. And so this is quite horse rider specific with the posture that we adopt when we're getting on a horse or when we're sitting on the horse. But this is also, you can carry this over into any other part of life, anything else that you're doing, when we're kind of transitioning from maybe being a little bit more sedentary to then going and being a bit more active, or if it's a kind of sports specific thing, you can carry this over as well. So I'm just going to show you a couple of really simple little stretches. As I said, this is sort of more horse rider specific, but these stretches are great if you're really into your cycling, if you're really into your walking, running, rowing, anything like that. So it definitely carries over to all sorts of different areas. It doesn't necessarily just have to be for the horse rider. But the reason that we do this, and it's been shown to make a really marked difference for a lot of people, when we adapt to kind of a particular position, when we adopt a particular position, particularly in a sport, and we're kind of working quite hard in that position, as we might be when we're on our horses, we will form these, I think I mentioned in our last video, we get kind of stuck a little bit in these particular areas. And if it's a kind of repeated pattern, if we're sitting in the same position for, as on our horses, or if we're doing the same motion over and over again, the body kind of adopts these patterns, which is fine. It makes it easier to do that particular thing, but then very often we get a little bit stuck, and it may well be that we then need to actually undo some of that work for ourselves. We actually make it harder for ourselves, and we create these little patterns that might be a little bit stuck or a little bit sticky for us. So one of the really useful things that we can do is stretch before we start to do any particular movement. So for us as horse riders, before we actually get on our horse, it can be really, really useful to just go through a little sequence of stretches. And we can, you can kind of work one-to-one, and we can get very tailored in terms of what you specifically need. But on the whole, there are some really good overall general stretches that the vast majority of us are going to benefit from in some way as we're on our horses, or as we're kind of getting onto our horses. So that's what we're going to go through. So this is the idea for this, is that it's something that you could start to build in. It might take 30 seconds, it might take 5 minutes. You can kind of play around with it in terms of how long you want it to take. But you can do it in the stable, you can do it on the yard just before you're getting on at the mountain block. And the idea for this is that it will just loosen up your body a little bit, and it will very, very slightly change the length of the muscles, the stability in the body, where we're feeling a little bit tighter. And chances are you will notice, if you do this every day as you're riding, or if you do it quite regularly, you will start to notice that each time you go through these stretches, they might feel a little bit different each time. So the first day you do it, you might notice one particular thing, one side might feel tighter than the other. The next day, it might be the other side that feels a little bit tighter, and it might move around the body. Or you may well notice that actually each time you go and do this particular stretch, it feels tight on the same side every time, and it feels looser on the other side every time. So just start to notice, start to build it into your sort of awareness of your own body, what you're actually feeling when you're doing these stretches. So be quite sort of actively processing what you're feeling in your body as we do these, and you can do that hopefully before you go and get on your horse next time, and see if it makes any difference for you. It might be quite subtle, or it might be quite a marked difference when you're actually then sitting on your horse and thinking how everything feels in the body. Okay, so I'm going to show you these stretches now. Now, if you just think about the position that we take as horse riders when you're sitting on the horse, we've got a little bit of flexion in the hip. Okay, if you imagine me sitting on a horse now, we've got a flexion in the hip, we've got flexion in the back of the knee, and then we've got flexion in the ankle when we're in the stirrup there. So we've got that kind of bent position in the leg. Now obviously, if you compare that to a straight leg, the posture is slightly different. It all looks a little bit different. So when we bend that leg, we're changing the joints, we're changing the muscles and the length of the muscles, okay? So the hamstring, that's a little bit shorter. The hip flexor, which is up here, that's a little bit shorter. And then we've changed some of the structure around the ankle and the foot as well. So the stretches that we're going to do, that I'm going to show you today, that you might want to just throw into your sequence before you're getting on. Maybe put your hat on, put your boots on, your gloves on, do these stretches and then get on. So just add it in somewhere. These stretches are specifically for those areas. So your hip flexor, which is at the front of the leg here, it's the muscle that we use to flex the hip, shockingly, to bring the knee up. Okay, so that's the job of the hip flexor. And obviously when we're sat on the horse, that hip flexor is tight all the time, or it's not necessarily tight all the time, but the line of the hip flexor is different to when it's down and we're in a kind of more neutral standing position. Okay, so if we spend a lot of time in that hip flexed position, obviously that's just going to be altering the muscle, the hip flexor itself. Same with the hamstring, which is the other one that we're going to target here. So hamstring is the big muscle that goes down the back of your thigh. We've probably all felt cramp in this muscle at some point or another. And the job of the hamstring is to flex the knee. Okay, so it's to bend the knee there. Now again, we're not necessarily actively using the hamstring when we're sitting on our horse and our leg is bent there, but that muscle is always, when it's relaxed, when we're sitting on the horse, it can be a little bit shorter than it can when we're in standing, and that muscle is lengthened in its kind of neutral position. So we're naturally relaxing with a slightly shorter muscle in the hamstring and in the hip flexor when we're sitting on our horse. So, and that's just when we're passive, all right? When we're kind of doing different aids and asking different questions, obviously those muscles are going to have to be working as well. So it's quite typical for a lot of us as horse riders to have quite tight hip flexors and quite tight hamstrings over time, okay? Not necessarily for everybody, but generally speaking, those muscles, even if they're not particularly tight for you personally, it's a good idea to start to stretch those muscles before and maybe even after you've got on your horse and done a little session. So your hip flexor stretch, which is the one we're going to do first, you're going to take a slightly wider stance with your legs. Okay, now we talk about hip socket distance. So you want roughly a fist in between your feet and then roughly in between your knees, and that's a kind of natural setup for the hips and for the pelvis. So we don't want it too wide and we don't want it too narrow. So just think very roughly hip socket distance, and it's the width of your sockets at your hip that goes down to your knee and goes down to your feet. So roughly hip socket distance, and then you're going to stagger the feet at hip socket distance. Okay, so the only reason I'm touching on that is so that we don't start to take the feet really, really wide as we do this stance. So take one foot back behind you, roughly hip socket distance with the feet. It doesn't matter too much how wide the legs are. We've got quite a big range here and we can find a pretty good stretch whether the legs are really wide or whether they're quite narrow. Okay, now first of all I want you to think about your hips pointing forwards. Okay, so not allowing the hips to go off to the side on a diagonal, hips pointing forwards, and that may well mean that your back heel lifts off the floor. That's fine if that's the case. You're also more than welcome to have your back knee bent a little bit if you want to. Now the next thing I want you to just be aware of is your knee on your front leg. We want it above the heel. We don't want it above the toes or going too far forward. So think about that knee above the heel on your front foot. Hips pointing forwards. Now what we're going to do here is think about tucking your tail under. That may mean your heel lifts, may mean your knee bends more. That's fine if that's the case, but think about tucking your tail under a little bit, and hopefully what you will start to feel is a good stretch around the hip flexor on your back leg. So we're targeting the top of the leg on your back leg, top front of the leg on the back leg, and it's this muscle here that goes down the front of the thigh and into the hip. So hopefully you can start to feel a little bit of a stretch here. If you want to feel a slightly stronger stretch, feel free to just bring your arms up and then ever so slightly bring in a little bit of a reach upwards. Don't think about going backwards, think about going up nice and long. So we'll hold that maybe for 30 seconds. And then you can bring the arms down if you've used the arm, nice and slowly. Bring the hands onto your front thigh and then lean forwards and just push yourself back up. Give the legs a little bit of a shake out. We'll do that on the other side. So again, staggering the feet, hip socket distance, so we want to avoid the legs being too wide, too far apart. Think about that hip pointing forward, so not letting the hips come off to the side, hips pointing forwards. The back heel can lift, the knee can bend, that's all good, but think about your knee on your front leg being roughly above the heel rather than too far forwards over that foot, so knee above the heel. And then from here, you're just going to think about tucking your tail under slightly, flatten your back, and hopefully, quite quickly, you'll feel quite a good stretch coming onto your hip flexor here in that area of the body. Keep the hips pointing forwards, and if you want to, you're more than welcome to bring the arms up, reaching up. Feel free to lift the eye line and just lengthen the front of that hip. Well done. So again, we'd hold that for about 30 seconds on that side, and then bring the arms down, hands onto the front leg, and then push yourself forwards. Give the legs a little bit of a shake out. So you may well notice that one side feels longer, or one side feels tighter, than the other. Again, all good stuff to just be aware of for yourself. And then the next stretch we're going to come into is a hamstring stretch. Now there's, as always, lots of different ways we can stretch the muscles, so this is just one way, but we're going to have the feet and knees at hip socket distance again. You're going to step 1 foot forwards, so stagger your feet. Now you're going to bend your back knee, so bend the back knee and bring your hands onto that thigh. So the hands come onto the thigh of your bent leg, not onto the straight leg. Bring your hands onto your bent leg, which is your back leg. And then from here, keeping your front leg straight, we're just going to start to lean forwards. And you can lean forwards as far as you need to start to feel a stretch in the back of your straight leg. And that's the hamstring there on your straight leg that you'll feel tightening up. You may well feel it down into your calf, down into the underside of the foot. You might feel it up into the glute, big muscle in the bum there. You might feel it in the back. But we're targeting somewhere between the back of the bum and the knee. And if you want to, you can come lower. You can bring the hands down towards the floor. You can start to drop the head. It all just depends how tight we are naturally there at that moment in time. So again, hold that for about 30 seconds and then nice and slowly restack, bring yourself back up. We'll change sides. So give the legs a little shake out and then swap your feet over. We're going to bend the back knee and bring your hands onto the thigh of that back leg. So the hands are on the bent leg. And then nice and slowly start to tip the body forwards over your straight leg. Take some nice deep breaths if this feels really tight. And again, feel free, you can come lower if you want to, bringing the hands down onto the floor. You can lower the head. Make sure it feels manageable for that hamstring, but stay with your breathing. So again, we'd hold that for roughly 30 seconds and then bring yourself back up nice and slowly. Give the legs a little shake out. Okay, so that's 2 good stretches for your hamstrings and for your hip flexors. So give it a go, see if you can build that in to your next riding session and see if you notice any difference when you then sit on the horse, when you straight away then sit on the horse. See if anything feels any different, see if your legs feel any longer, if your seat feels any different. Give it a try. Feel free to let us know how you get on with that one.